Hi everyone, and welcome to another installment of me trying to dodge Donk and Honchkrow in order to bring you some quality expanded content. This week, I'm taking one of Standard's rogue darlings, Rapid Strike Malamar, and I'm gonna see if we can make it even more bonkers than it already is. Jumping right in, we have our deck boss, Malamar. It's basically a psychic Rapid Strike version of Baby Blacephalon from Unbroken Bonds, if memory serves me correctly, with one arguably broken distinction. Its attack, Rapid Strike Tentacles, does 40 damage for every Rapid Strike card you reveal in your hand, and then you shuffle those cards back into your deck. So, while it doesn't hit as hard as Baby Blounds, the thing that arguably makes it better is that you don't discard the resources used for its attack. You shuffle them back. So, in essence, your resources don't diminish. Rather, they get refined down, or at least that's one way you could look at it. Basically, as long as you have the means to draw into a fresh hand, you'll often end up seeing more and more of your Rapid Strike cards because you're going to be using the non-Rapid Strike cards to access them throughout the game, right? So your deck basically gets thinned down to the point where it's more Rapid Strike cards than not, which means that off of your draw supporters, you're seeing a lot more of the ammo that you need. So basically, in the late game, if you hit one of your really good draw supporters, you have a pretty good chance of seeing at least 160 to 240 effective damage in hand, and that's before you add all of your other extenders. Next up, we have Octillery, which allows us to fetch any Rapid Strike card once per turn. This is great, and if nothing else, it typically ensures that you have some follow-up. Although it is sad that you can only use the ability once per turn, not once per Octillery, just once per turn, but then if you could use it more than once, it would probably be broken. Our first extender is Cinccino, which has the wonderful Make Do ability. Kind of like Zoroark GX Trade, although on a one prizer. This lets you discard one card from your hand in order to draw two cards. So it's really nice because you can dig further in your deck in search of ammo for your Malamar's attacks, and you can kind of get rid of those non-Rapid Strike cards to ensure that you are seeing more of the Rapid Strike cards later on. Our second extender is Oricorio GX. Its Dance of Tribute ability lets you draw 3 cards as long as one of your Pokemon was KO'd the previous turn, I believe by damage from the opponent's attack. With how often our Malamars are getting blown up, this lets you see 3 extra cards fairly regularly, ensuring that your recovery is pretty good if not perfect all the time. And we have Ditto Prism Star since we've got 3 different Stage 1 lines in the deck. It just provides some unparalleled flexibility, especially in the early game when you effectively need to have 1 to 2 of each of the Stage 1 lines on board right away. So super helpful to have this one piece on hand. And then we have Execute. Thanks to its propagation ability, you can discard it over and over again, essentially making things like Make Do totally free. And this is really important because you really don't want to discard your Rapid Strike cards. Our draw supporter package is pretty simple. Cynthia is a solid shuffle draw 6. Bruno gives us a shuffle draw 7 if one of our guys is KO'd by damage the previous turn, and Karina's Focus is there more as ammo for Malamar, but it can pair with Octillery to provide a bit of recovery and ensure at least a decent Rapid Strike tentacle attack. Oh, and Guzma is there for gusting and pairs nicely with Tower of Waters to ensure some board shuffling shenanigans. We've got 2 VS Seekers here because you just really can't afford to see unusable cards in the early game, but there are times when you need to fetch back a Guzma for that key KO, or even grab back a Karina's Focus if you were forced to use one earlier and you just need that extra card in hand to make the damage work. Battle Compressor is a nice one-off to dump Execute into the discard pile, and also to thin out cards to help you more consistently find your Rapid Strike ammo. As for our Pokeball package, well, it's pretty stacked. Fog Crystal and Mysterious Treasure provide easy outs to Inkay, Malamar, and the occasional Psychic Energy. A Level Ball grabs all of our basics and can also fetch Cinccino, which makes it very valuable in the early game. And Great Ball works pretty well thanks to our thick Pokemon count. It's one of the few ways we have to find Octillery, which is also something to note. This was 2 Ultra Balls before in an earlier version of the list, but in testing I often found that I had to dump valuable Rapid Strike cards in order to fetch the Octillery, and Octillery is only getting you 1 more card, so you'd actually end up more often than not having fewer Rapid Strike cards in hand than before, which means you're not doing as much damage. So Great Ball has ended up working out pretty well. Tower of Waters helps make retreating a bit easier, but ideally it should just stay in hand as Rapid Strike ammo, so really only play this down if you've got a Remoraid stuck in the active or something like that. U-turn board is a nice recursive way to shuffle around our board, especially if you've had a bad start like an Oricorio GX or even just a Minccino in the active, because they can't take advantage of Tower of Waters in a pinch. Ordinary Rod is a must-have at 2 because Malamars go quickly, and you not only need to recur them to keep up your board presence, but also because spare squids also make for ammo in the hand. And also, given my luck, I'm going to prize multiple pieces of the Malamar lines, so just ensuring that I always have access to the follow-up evolution is key here. Spiral Energy is basically Rainbow Energy for Rapid Strike Pokemon. Ideally, you prefer to attach basic Psychic to Malamar, but in a pinch this will of course let you get off the attack, and it is searchable thanks to Octillery. But again, like most of the stuff in the deck, just try and keep these in hand to use with Malamar's attack, especially because as a special energy, once it's gone, it's gone. And finally, we have our 3 basic Psychic energies. Personally, I almost never play low counts of basic energy, especially not this low, but thanks to the double Ordinary Rods and the multiple Fog Crystals, you actually end up seeing these more often than not. And that's the deck. It is a slow starter, which is kind of ironic because it's a Rapid Strike deck, but once you establish your board, there is very little to stop this deck from steamrolling your opponent. And boy, the damage this deck can output gets downright scary if your opponent doesn't have the means to disrupt your engine. In testing, the most I was able to dish out was 440 damage without weakness, which should give you an idea of how terrifying this deck is for enemy multi-prizers. Single prizers, however, are another matter. You might have a rough time because you often go down a prize or 2 before you get rolling, and you don't really have any means of disrupting your opponent's plays, so keep that in mind. All in all, this is kind of a meme deck, but it is a meme deck with serious bite. And now with all that out of the way, let's jump onto the ladder and practice our Squid Fu. Okay, so getting off to a very interesting start, I saw the Dark Deck box and thought, oh, this would be really nice if it ended up being Grimmsnarl VMAX. But no, it ended up being the stuff of my nightmares, as the other big scary Dark VMAX out there on the expanded ladder, which is of course Eternatus. And coming up against Eternatus with a really bad start like I'm having here, does not bode well. But thankfully, you know, you are watching this game here, so at the very least, you know, I didn't get donked, which was a very real possibility as my opponent goes through their first turn here. Unfortunately, I just execute as my basic. Well, it's not good against Eternatus because, as you will see shortly, Eternatus plays a lot of Galarian Zigzagoons, and it just takes 3 pings to knock me out of the game here. And that's pretty much what my opponent does. In fact, I think they did do their best here to prioritize the donk because, hey, there's a Zigzagoon to start with. And, you know, with access to a Crobat and multiple scoop-up nets, this was more than doable, right? I'm only here because I guess I got very, very lucky in this particular case and managed to dodge that. But my opponent is going to go for it, and regardless, they're still going to be able to establish their board pretty well. They're going to get down the Eternatus V, they're going to get the capture energy on it as well, so they can kind of just start swarming their board and make sure that they've got the backup ready to go. So mercifully, I survived this turn, and since I have 4 Pokeball options in hand, I'm basically guaranteeing that I'm going to establish my board pretty well. So what I'm looking for the most part is 2 Inkay, and then ideally a Minccino and a Remoraid. Because that basically means that going into the next turn, I have my Malamar, and then a backup Inkay ready to evolve up into a Malamar after that. I have the Cinccino to start drawing a ton of cards, and I have the Octillery for that Rapid Strike search ability, which is just gonna, improve my consistency overall. I'm really gonna need it, because as far as draw supporters go, Bruno is not super ideal in this situation. Obviously, if my opponent goes all in on these Zigzagoon pings, which they are now, and if they get a KO, which they likely will, then okay, great, I can see at least 7 fresh cards and hopefully come in with a backup attacker. But, I'm also in a precarious situation here because my opponent goes for the Marnie, and if they're able to hit enough Zigzagoon pings, they can not only take out my Execute, but they can also basically force me to put up an Inkay and then set me down to just one attacker, right? And if I whiff the follow-up Inkay on my turn, then it is pretty much as good as game. But thankfully, they at least put the Execute in the discard pile for me, meaning that it's going to end up being a resource a little later on. And then the Chaotic Swell comes down, which makes me think, okay, well, if I at least see the Tower of Waters, I know I can keep it in hand. And my opponent, of course, goes for the big Dread End here, putting me down to 1 Inkay and making me incredibly nervous. Now, I'm forced to bench the Oricorio, which again is not ideal because my opponent can boss that and increase their already sizable prize lead, but at the very least I am able to get the Mysterious Treasure and go for the Malamar here. Now, the game state was already so bad, I just wanted to see if I could maybe get off one big attack and just be done with it, but thankfully the Korrina's Focus does get me into a Cinccino, and it gets me the follow-up Inkay that is so important. Now, it's still very vulnerable. I could very easily lose next turn if my opponent's able to hit enough Galarian Zigzagoons and scoop up nets. But at least for now, I'll be able to get an attack off and at least chunk the Eternatus. And now that I've got my Cinccino on board and the Propagation Execute going, I can just see a few extra cards to make sure that I've got my follow-up guaranteed for next turn. The Bruno there being particularly nice because I'm going to be shuffling away a draw supporter and some energy. Using Bruno alongside Oricorio and Cinccino, it means that, if your guys do get KO'd, you have a pretty powerful follow-up the next turn. Now, my opponent's got pretty good follow-up here too. They're going to recur a Marnie, which is going to be the bane of my existence throughout this game, and they're also going to get the backup Eternatus VMAX. At this point, they've got the 3 on board, so, knocking one of these out is not going to drop their board down to a pretty rough state. But on the other hand, it also means that once they fill up their board with Galarian Zigzagoons, as they're trying to take out my guys, they actually won't be able to put anything else down, which means that, any interesting options like a Darkrai EX, for example, which would really ruin my day here, or if they're maybe running a small Weavile package, none of that stuff is going to happen here. So at the very least, there is that, right? And hey, they go for the big Dread End and get a nice 540 damage hit off, which I'm going to have a really hard time answering. But hey, we're not without hope. I've got the Bruno there, so I'm able to throw that down, see 7 fresh cards, which is going to give me most of what I need to at least assure my follow-up. I get the Malamar, of course, and I've got the Level Ball to make sure that I can get an Inkay as well. But the game actually glitches out there. I know for a fact I clicked on the Level Ball, but it threw down the Remoraid, which is not great. But I kind of just have to make do with what happened, if you will. Totally intentional pun. So basically, I have to get the follow-up Inkay regardless, and I have to bench it, which means that whatever attack I go for, it's not going to be quite as potent. It's a very real possibility that I miss the KO here, and if I do, that is pretty much game, because I'm fairly certain my opponent's going to have boss in hand, if not this turn, the turn after, and obviously taking 2 prizes after KOing my Malamar is just, it's going to be game. But thankfully, I'm able to draw into some pretty good pieces. I guarantee my follow-up Inkay, and I'm able to shuffle back some of my Malamar pieces as well, just to make sure that, going into the next turn, I'm not without hope of getting another attack off. And I haven't used Oricorio's Dance of Tribute just yet either, so I can extend a little bit further into my deck, see a few more cards, and thankfully are all Rapid Strikers. The other thing I do actually, and one of the reasons I really like having the 2 off VS Seeker here, is even if I'm not going to play it, I can grab back the Korrina's Focus with the VS Seeker and ensure that, I still have a Rapid Strike card in hand to make the math work. And I do have quite enough here to take the KO. I think I actually could have used one less card in this particular case. Actually, no, I suck at math. That was exactly the amount I needed to play down, and thankfully I have the Cynthia in hand, which is going to mean a fresh 6 cards on follow-up. And I do grab my other Minccino out of the prizes, but by this point it's too late. The game glitching out and forcing that Remoraid down just means that, well, I'm in a pretty rough spot. Now, my opponent actually goes for the Marnie here, which is a double-edged sword. It kind of sucks because I really like the follow-up I had. I would have had the energy and the Malamar pretty easily. And it also means that in this particular case, I'll have to shuffle away a couple of Rapid Strike cards before I can go in, but hey, you know, to each their own. And my opponent actually whiffs the attack here off of the Marnie, which is really interesting. I throw the U-turn board down just to get it out of my hand, basically, and ensure that if I have to use Korrina's Focus, I'm seeing more cards than not, but instead I'm able to just guarantee the follow-up attack by attaching the basic energy to Inkay. Now, I don't see a ton of Rapid Strike cards here, certainly not enough to take a big KO on the Eternatus, but, you know, I'm still able to see a few more thanks to Octillery and the one Cinccino I've got in play. I can at the very least chunk it to the point where even if my opponent wants to boss up and take out the Oricorio on the following turn, they've basically left 2 effective Malamars on board that could still pretty easily take the KO, especially if my opponent doesn't know that I'm almost Bruno's here. Now, hitting the Battle Compressor, because Execute is already in the discard pile, there's not too much I want to do here. I don't want to eliminate any outs to useful Pokemon, particularly any outs that'll get me a Rapid Strike card in hand. The Guzma might be handy as well, because again, I don't know if my opponent has the Dark Rhyhorn, so needing to chase down the Eternatus might be something I gotta do. And, you know, VS Seekers are pretty hard to hit on their own. So, you know, I'm just going to continue to pull some stuff out. I get rid of the Fog Crystal, which maybe could have been an out to Energy or an Inkay later on. But basically, I just want to thin my deck as much as possible here, so that when I hit the Cynthia on the following turn, I basically guarantee that I see more Rapid Strike cards than not. Right? Like, even if my opponent takes out the Oricorio at this point, I'm going to see 6 fresh cards off of the Cynthia, which will be great. I'll see an extra card off of Octillery, most likely my follow-up Malamar, and then I can see at least 2 extra cards off of the Make Do, which should in theory be enough to take out the Eternatus, because I just need to hit 5 Rapid Strike cards in order to take the KO here. So, put up the Cinccino, I already have the energy ready to go. I actually decided to attach it to the Cinccino here just in case I need to go for the energy assist. For whatever reason, I actually whiffed the attack here, even though whiffing the attack here is going to be game pretty much. But you never know, you can do some cute stuff here. Maybe you need to guarantee the basic energy, make sure that I have the Spiral energy in hand for later. But things are looking pretty good here. So I managed to get my follow-up Malamar ready to go, and I'm in a bit of a tricky place here, because I might not make it. It's going to depend on how many Inkays I left in deck for myself as well. You know, off of a level ball, thankfully, though, I am able to grab one more Remoraid, which is pretty much going to seal things up. I think that is the 5 I need here, but I decided to BM my opponent a little bit by digging extra hard here and just blowing out the Eternatus, because that 540 damage hit really made me mad, as did the Zigzagoon shenanigans. So just as much as possible, you know, I wanted to stretch things out a little bit and go for the biggest hit that I possibly could. And bringing up the Malamar, you know, this is pretty much game here. I think I even go and dig out the Korrina's Focus with the VS Seeker, or at least attempt to. But then I remembered, oh, I actually put this back, so I'm just going to throw the Bruno back in to guarantee my follow-up. And I'm going to go for the gigantic Rapid Strike Tentacles, taking an easy KO on the Eternatus. And, you know, snatching what I think was a pretty rough game, and turning it into a victory. So, hey, there we go. Okay, so this next match, I think it's best summed up by something that friend of the show, Brandon McLeod, said on Twitter recently. He was trying, I think, the single strike Urshifu archetype out and actually ended up resorting to expanded for a little bit. And he was saying that expanded kind of just looks like standard these days. And it sort of felt that way. I know most of these cards are actually just expanded now. They rotated out very recently, but it's kind of strange to see a deck that just a few weeks ago, I guess a month and change, you know, this was standard fare, right? And for the most part, outside of stuff like Dimension Valley, the Master Ball, obviously, and I think VS Seeker, my opponent is actually running a fairly standard list as well. By now, you can probably tell that this is going to be a Mew Dark Box, which is a really interesting take on the deck because, of course, it patches up your weakness against fighting types using Mew 3 as your primary attacker, but you still have, you know, access to really great options like the Umbreon and Darkrai GX, for example, which can KO something instantly and provide a bit of item denial. You, of course, have the Galarian Moltres V here as a really solid 2-prize attacker. And then, you know, something I'm very worried about and that I do see later on in the game is the Mega Sableye and Tyranitar, which can let you take extra prizes if you KO a GX, which is well within this deck's ability to do because it plays a ton of Dedenne, Crobat, and consistency options like Trainer's Mail. So, you know, digging out that Gust when you need it is not a problem. And obviously, if my opponent's able to set up the Weavile GX, moving the energy around and shuffling the board around, you know, it's not going to be hard to get their KO. So I actually have a pretty rough start here. Starting Remoraid is not ideal, but I at least have enough on board to set up a backup Remoraid, get an Inkay going, and dig just a little bit to get the backup Inkay as well. So at least now I'm not going to effectively be donked by my opponent just taking the one-shot on me. And, you know, as best as I know, if I can remember correctly, Umbreon and Darkrai, it only does the bench snipe damage against GXs and EXs. So, you know, my opponent's just going to be taking one prize at a time outside of any weird techs like Naganadel GX, for example. But hey, you know, at the end of the day, I actually ended up establishing a pretty good board, even though I had to burn the Korrina's Focus. So if my opponent doesn't gust up the Inkay and take that out, then hey, you know, they'll have to go through the Remoraid, which means I can free up a bench spot for something else. I have my 2 Inkay ready to go, and I have my 2 Minchinos on board as well, so that I can start drawing cards. And this is particularly important because my opponent battle compressored away a Noivern GX and has the Dimension Valley in play, which means that item lock is a real possibility here. Thankfully, item lock doesn't hurt my deck too much. It does hurt in the sense that, you know, my many Pokeball cards do become kind of bricks in the hand. And I do use them a lot, at least to get my board established, like obviously Level Ball for the Chinchino, Mysterious Treasure, Fog Crystal to dig out my Malamar pieces, things like that. But instead, they actually just go for the Claw Slash, deeming it more important to go for the big damage and just guarantee the KO, which, you know, fine by me. I see my own battle compressor, so I'm immediately going to dump the Execute to ensure that I can start with my Chinchino shenanigans, and I also dump the 2 Guzmas because for the most part, I'm just going to want to KO the active. There aren't going to be a lot of cases where I'm going to want to kind of gust around, and really, you know, I need to prioritize drawing cards off of things like Bruno and Cynthia. So thankfully, I'm able to hit a Fog Crystal, which means I'm gonna get my energy here. I'm maybe not gonna get the biggest attack off in the world after I finish establishing my board, but it's more important to establish the board in this particular case because I don't have a follow-up draw supporter, and depending on what my opponent is able to throw down, if they get rid of my Chinchinos or anything like that, I'm just not gonna have anything to draw into the necessary pieces. And benching the Oricorio this early on is also a huge risk because there are a lot of ways to take that out on my opponent's side, either through brute force on the Mewtwo side, going into the Moltres, for example. There are a lot of ways that can spell doom for me, and especially the aforementioned Mega Sableye and Tyranitar GX. But actually, I end up seeing a pretty good number of pieces here. Maybe, again, not everything I need, because I do want to have the follow-up supporter, Cynthia or Bruno, ideally. But I actually get a decent amount here, and I'm able to chunk the Mewtwo if I want to. Now, I go for that big hit, and in fact, with weakness, it is just enough to take him out, which really sets my opponent back quite a bit, because it means that outside of establishing another Mew 3, they're going to have to rely on their multi-prize attackers. And the good thing too is that I have plenty of options to work with, at least on my following turn, as long as my opponent doesn't establish another Mewtwo and start going for some item denial shenanigans. I should actually be in a pretty good state, again, as long as I can dodge the Mega Sableye and Tyranitar. And here, for the most part, my opponent is just burning through their deck. I think they're really looking for the Weavile GX or the Darkrai EX, so they can of course move the Crobat out of the way or start shuffling energies around, but they actually just end up going for the Guzma and find a juicy target in my Oricorio, which is going to make things a lot harder from here on out, because not having access to that extra 3 cards does hurt the consistency of this deck a lot. And once the Oricorio goes down the first time, I can't responsibly play it down again, because the Mega Sableye and Tyranitar will mean game instantly. And my opponent does kind of bench that just to say, hey, I'm gonna get you if you're careless. They start accelerating energy to it, so I know, yeah, I can't mess around. And they take a very easy KO and even up the prize trade. But the nice thing here is that I do have Malamar untouched, which means I don't have to waste valuable time or resources digging for Malamar pieces. Instead, I can kind of just start with my Cinccino, execute draw shenanigans, and hopefully build up enough pieces to take a KO. Which is well within reason, because between Fog Crystal and Mysterious Treasure, I also have 2 additional outs to my Malamar line. And with access hopefully to an Octillery, I could potentially get another piece, but if not, the Cinccinos should see me through. And in fact, what I actually do is dig out my Malamar pieces first, just to make sure that, hey, I've pretty much guaranteed that, with the 2 make-dos, I'm seeing 4 extra cards, and with how much I've already burned through my deck, I should be able to see what I need here. The smarter thing maybe would have been to Ordinary Rod out some additional pieces from the discard pile, but hey, it ended up not being too big of a deal. And I actually do a little bit of a misplay here. I should have brought back the Execute, but I actually just ended up dumping the Cynthia by accident. But hey, I play those VS Seekers, and it actually ends up working out in my favor, because I could always VS Seeker a Korrina's Focus back if I need to a little bit later on, right? It's always good to have access to that just in case, and in fact, I believe that is what I go for here, just to get it back into the deck, shuffle it back in if necessary, or of course have it in hand so that I can draw up to a fresh, 6 on the following turn. And because Moltres damages itself, it makes the threshold for KOing it a lot easier, which I do without too much trouble, I think. Yeah, take the tower as well, keep Korrina in hand just so I can draw up next turn, and really, my opponent doesn't have too much to do here. I've taken most of their energies out of play, even if they have the Tyranitar here, and even though it does resist Psychic, outside of hitting, 3 Dark Patches, maybe another Moltres, and then of course the Weavile GX, they're just not going to get another attacker powered up here, or at least nothing that's going to threaten to take 3 prizes anytime soon. And obviously throwing down another Mewtwo would be suicide at this point, because I've got the 2 Malamar ready to go. Even if they have the Weakness Guard energy, there's a really good chance that I can hit the, I think it's just 7 cards to guarantee the KO against the Mewtwo here. And if they don't have Weakness Guard, which a lot of these decks don't bother playing, then that'll be it, and my opponent does in fact scoop. So, yeah. Malamar is kinda legit. The level of damage that this deck can produce is straight up terrifying, and while I have to say it really doesn't run as smoothly as Baby Blounds, I still think it's a worthy successor to the deck. Now, this deck is also more fragile than Baby Blounds because, well, you're an evolution deck, and because you don't have access to the same caliber of consistency tools that the Welder archetype can offer, right? You don't have your giant hearths and your fire crystals and your fiery flints and all that. It is a little harder to see the pieces that you need overall. In particular, you just don't have the ability to threaten the big KO quite as early either. For example, if you let Baby Blounds go second, there's a real possibility that they could KO a tag team or even a VMAX if they hit their combo pieces at least often enough. Especially because Baby Blounds has access to stuff like Dedenne and Crobat because of the way that getting the resources works into your hand. You're not so worried necessarily about shuffling some stuff back here or there. You don't mind dumping fire energies for Baby Blounds, for example, because you got all that recovery to grab them back in a pinch. But again, the big difference here is that unlike Baby Blounds, you're not burning your resources. You're kind of recycling them. So late in the game, you are basically only drawing Rapid Strike cards, and your hand can reach such obscene levels that whatever attack you dish out, you're taking the KO, believe me. Now, ultimately, there's probably room to refine the list, and I would like to test out some stuff like Lucky Egg or even a Crobat V as means to draw cards a bit more effectively in the early to mid game. In particular, having to play 3 stage 1 lines does make me a little bit nervous because the deck can be janky at times. But, at least as far as a starting list goes, I don't think it's too bad. But anyway, if you guys enjoyed today's video, please leave a like, leave a comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. And in particular, if you've got any tweaks that you'd like to make to this list or any other decks that you'd like me to try out and expand it, let me know down below. And with that, I will leave you all to enjoy the rest of your day. I will catch you next time, and until then, take it easy.